Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes Debates.
Where we kind of unpack, those contrasting historical narratives.
Yeah, exactly. And today we are diving deep into two really compelling yet clashing accounts of the 1948 war in Palestine.
Oh, wow.
Benny Morris's 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War,
Okay.
and Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Right.
It's a heavy topic, but I always find it so fascinating to see how different historians can frame the same events in dramatically different ways.
Yeah, it really is a testament to how complex and nuanced history really is.
Exactly. So to kind of set the stage, let's start with a quick overview of each book's main argument. You ready?
Absolutely. Fire away.
Okay. So Morris, in his meticulously researched 1948 paints a picture of a war born from multiple causes, a clash of national aspirations between Jews and Arabs in land both claimed as their own.
Mm-hmm.
He delves into the military and diplomatic maneuvers, highlighting the roles of various actors, Jewish, Arab, and international, and ultimately concludes that while there were instances of expulsion, the Palestinian exodus wasn't like a result of a deliberate ethnic cleansing policy.
Yeah, I think Morris really emphasizes the chaotic nature of war, the fog of battle, and the role of individual decisions made in the heat of the moment.
Exactly. Now contrast that with Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Right.
He argues that the displacement of Palestinians was in fact a planned and systematic campaign orchestrated by Zionist leaders to secure a Jewish state with as few Palestinians as possible.
Yeah.
He presents evidence of massacres, expulsions, and psychological warfare designed to drive Palestinians from their homes.
Pappy's work is definitely more polemical,
Yeah.
more pointed in its accusations.
Right.
He leaves no room for ambiguity.
He does not. So right off the bat, we have two starkly different interpretations of the same historical event.
Yeah.
It's like looking at the same painting through two completely different filters.
It's definitely a challenge, but that's what makes this deep dive so intriguing, right?
Yeah.
We have to dig beneath the surface, examine the evidence, and try to understand the historical forces at play.
Okay, let's do it. Both books touch on the pre-war tensions that kind of set the stage for the 1948 conflict.
Yeah.
Specifically, they both discuss the Balfour Declaration of 1917.
Right.
How do they each interpret this pivotal document?
Well, Morris, as you might expect, approaches it with a focus on the political and diplomatic context. He sees the Balfour Declaration as a well-intentioned, albeit flawed attempt by the British to navigate the complexities of wartime alliances and their own strategic interests in the Middle East.
Yeah, he portrays it as a kind of clumsy balancing act,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Trying to appease both the Zionist aspirations for a Jewish homeland and the concerns of the Arab population already living in Palestine.
Precisely. He even points out the vague wording of the declaration, which ultimately left much room for interpretation and, sadly, conflict.
It's almost like they planted a time bomb without realizing it.
A very apt analogy. Now, Pappé takes a much more critical stance. He views the Balfour Declaration as a blatant act of colonialism, a prime example of Western powers making decisions about a land that wasn't theirs to give.
Okay.
He argues that it was a deliberate move to dispossess the Palestinians and pave the way for a Jewish state, essentially setting the stage for the ethnic cleansing he claims occurred in 1948.
Wow, so right from the get-go, we see these two completely different framings of the same event.
Exactly.
A well-intentioned but flawed policy versus a deliberate act of colonial dispossession.
And these contrasting interpretations color how each author analyzes everything that follows.
Yeah, it's fascinating how the same historical facts can be woven into such different narratives. Now, both books also delve into the Arab revolts of 1929 to 1936-39.
Right.
These were major uprisings against British rule and increasing Jewish immigration.
Yeah, these revolts were marked by widespread violent strikes and political activism,
Right.
and they played a significant role in shaping the trajectory of the conflict.
So how do Morris and Pappé approach these pivotal events?
Well, Morris, as is typical of his approach, emphasizes the multifaceted nature of the conflict. He acknowledges the very real anxieties and grievances of the Arab population,
Yeah.
the fear of being outnumbered, the economic marginalization, and the growing sense of Palestinian nationalism.
So he's not denying the legitimacy of their concerns.
Not at all. In fact, he even points out that some figures within the Zionist movement at the time were advocating for population transfer.
Yeah.
The idea of encouraging or even forcing Arabs to leave Palestine.
Wow.
However, he stopped short of claiming that this was a widespread policy or a driving force behind Zionist actions.
So he's acknowledging the complexities.
Yes.
The different strands of thought within both the Jewish and Arab community.
Exactly. Now, Pappé, true to his central thesis, sees the Arab revolts as a direct consequence of the Zionist project itself.
All right.
He argues that these uprisings were inevitable reactions to the ongoing dispossession and displacement of Palestinians, a desperate attempt to resist what he sees as a colonial takeover.
So for Pappé, these revolts are evidence of the inherent incompatibility of the two national movements vying for the same land.
Precisely. It's another example of how their fundamental interpretations shape their analysis of specific events.
Okay, so we've got two contrasting views on the Balfour Declaration and the Arab revolts.
Right.
What about the role of external actors like Britain and the United Nations,
Okay.
particularly the UNSCOP partition plan?
Ah, yes. The UNSCOP plan, an attempt to divide Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab with Jerusalem under international control, is a crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Morris, again highlighting the international complexities, portrays UNSCOP as a well-intentioned but ultimately doomed effort to find a peaceful resolution to the conflict.
He describes the UNSCOP members traveling throughout Palestine, meeting with leaders from both sides,
Yes.
and trying to grasp the realities on the ground, right?
Yes. He paints a picture of a committee grappling with deep mistrust between the two sides, escalating violence and pressure from various actors, both local and international.
It sounds like they were tasked with an almost impossible mission.
Indeed. And ultimately, the plan failed to prevent the war, and it was rejected by the Palestinian leadership, who saw it as an attempt to legitimize the dispossession of their land.
Okay.
Right.
Now, how does Pappé frame the UNSCOP plan?
Well, unsurprisingly, he takes a more critical view.
Yeah.
He argues that the committee was biased from the start in favor of the Zionists.
Okay.
Pointing to the composition of the committee, several members had close ties to the Zionist movement, and criticizing their methodology, claiming that they gave more weight to the Jewish perspective.
So he sees it as a rigged game from the beginning.
Yes. And he even suggests that the partition plan itself, despite being presented as a compromise, was designed to benefit the Jewish state at the expense of the Palestinians.
It's remarkable how even events involving international actors are interpreted so differently.
Absolutely.
Now, both books delve into the role of militias on both sides of the conflict, and this is where things get really heated.
Absolutely. We're talking about organized, often well-trained paramilitary forces that played a significant role in shaping the course of the war.
So on the Jewish side, we have the Haganah, the main Zionist paramilitary organization, which later became the foundation of the Israel Defense Forces.
Right. They were relatively well-organized with a clear command structure, training camps, and even a rudimentary intelligence service. But alongside them were the more militant right-wing groups like the Irgun and the Stern Gang, known for their aggressive tactics and attacks against both British targets and Arab civilians.
These groups were considered terrorist organizations by the British, and even some within the Zionist movement saw them as dangerous extremists.
Exactly. And their actions, particularly those targeting civilians, remain highly controversial to this day.
Now, on the Arab side, things were a bit more fragmented.
Right.
The main organized force was the Arab Liberation Army, composed of volunteers from neighboring Arab countries. However, they lacked the same level of organization and training as the Haganah. And alongside the ALA, there were numerous local militias, often operating independently with varying degrees of coordination and effectiveness.
Right.
So you have this complex web of armed groups, all vying for power and influence in an incredibly volatile situation.
Right.
How do Morris and Pappé approach this tangled landscape of militias?
Well, it's fascinating because despite their divergent overall narratives, they actually converge on some key points.
Good.
Both acknowledge that the militias on both sides played a crucial role in escalating the violence that ultimately led to the war.
They both describe how the militias engaged in attacks and reprisals, often targeting civilians, creating a vicious cycle of fear and retribution.
Right, but where they differ, of course, is in their interpretation of the motives behind this violence.
Okay, so break down their different interpretations for us.
Well, Morris tends to frame the actions of the Jewish militias, particularly the Haganah, as primarily defensive in nature. He argues that they were responding to Arab attacks and that their primary goal was to protect Jewish communities.
So he's placing their actions within the context of the perceived threats they faced.
Exactly. He even suggests that some of the more controversial actions, like the Deir Yassin massacre, which we can discuss later, were exceptions rather than the rule, tragic aberrations fueled by the chaos of war.
So while not condoning the violence, He's attempting to provide a more nuanced understanding of the motivations behind it.
Precisely. Now, Pappé, as you might anticipate, sees things very differently.
Hmm?
He views the actions of the Jewish militias, especially those of the more extreme groups,
Right.
as part of a deliberate strategy of ethnic cleansing. He argues that they intentionally targeted Arab civilians to instill terror and drive them from their homes, clearing the way for a Jewish state.
So for Pappé, these acts of violence aren't aberrations, but rather evidence of a calculated plan.
Exactly. He uses specific examples of massacres and expulsions, arguing that they fit into a broader pattern of systematic displacement.
Wow, it's incredible how the same events can be interpreted so differently. It really underscores the importance of examining the evidence and considering multiple perspectives.
Absolutely. And this debate over the role of militias and their actions is still incredibly sensitive and contentious today, shaping the narratives and perceptions of both Israelis and Palestinians.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past. It continues to have a profound impact on the present.
And that brings us to another key topic that both books address.
Okay.
The question of transfer, or the forced displacement of populations, a highly controversial issue that lies at the heart of the debate about whether ethnic cleansing occurred in 1948.
Right, because transfer implies a deliberate policy of expulsion, a very serious accusation.
Exactly, and that's where Morris and Pappé's interpretations diverge sharply once again.
Okay, so let's break down their different approaches to this sensitive issue.
Well, Morris, while acknowledging that instances of forced displacement occurred on both sides during the war, stops short of claiming there was a systematic plan of ethnic cleansing orchestrated by Zionist leaders.
He describes how villages were depopulated, how people were expelled from their homes, and how many became refugees.
Right.
But he argues that many of these expulsions were the result of local circumstances, military necessity, fear of reprisals, panic, the fog of war, rather than a deliberate policy from above.
He even suggests that some expulsions were carried out against the wishes of the Zionist leadership, pointing to the chaotic nature of the conflict and the difficulty of controlling events on the ground.
So he's presenting a more nuanced picture, acknowledging the expulsions while arguing against a deliberate and systematic policy.
Precisely. Now, Pappé, in stark contrast, is unequivocal in his assertion that ethnic cleansing did take place.
Okay.
He argues that the expulsion of Palestinians was a central part of the Zionist plan from the very beginning, a necessary step in creating a Jewish state with a Jewish majority.
He points to Plan Dalet, a Haganah plan that he claims outlined a strategy for systematically expelling Palestinians from key areas.
And he uses evidence from archival documents, military orders, and eyewitness accounts to support his claim, arguing that these expulsions were carried out systematically and ruthlessly.
So once again, we have two diametrically opposed interpretations, each with its own set of evidence and underlying assumptions. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with two different sets of pieces that don't quite fit together.
It's a challenging task, no doubt, and it underscores the need for critical thinking. For carefully weighing the evidence and considering the biases inherent in any historical account.
It's also a reminder that history is not just about facts. It's about interpretation, about the narratives we construct to make sense of the past.
And these narratives, as we've seen, can have a profound impact on how we understand the present and even how we envision the future.
I think we've covered a lot of ground already. We've delved into the pre-war tensions, the role of militias, and the contentious question of transfer. It's clear that Morris and Pappé offer radically different interpretations of these crucial aspects of the 1948 war.
They do, and these contrasting narratives will continue to inform our discussion as we move forward. It's going to be fascinating to see how they each tackle the involvement of neighboring Arab states in the war.
That's next on our agenda. Stay tuned as we continue to unpack these clashing historical accounts and delve deeper into the complexities of this pivotal event.
It's going to be a thought-provoking journey. Welcome back to our deep dive into the events of 1948 in Palestine.
We've been exploring, those contrasting perspectives presented in Benny Morris's 1948, a history of the first Arab-Israeli war, and Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And it's been a real eye-opener.
Yeah, it has. These two books, while dealing with the same historical events, offer such radically different interpretations.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle, where half the pieces have been painted over with a completely different picture.
A great analogy, and it raises so many questions about how we understand history, how we grapple with conflicting narratives, and ultimately, how we reconcile those competing versions of the past.
Okay, so we left off talking about the role of militias, which really highlights the stark differences in how Morris and Pappé approach this whole conflict.
Right, and now we're going to delve into another layer of complexity.
Okay.
The involvement of neighboring Arab states. This is where the 1948 war expands from a local conflict to a regional one.
Right.
With countries like Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq all sending troops into Palestine to fight against the newly formed Israeli state.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire. How do our two authors frame this intervention?
Well, Morris, with his emphasis on military and diplomatic strategy,
Okay.
portrays the Arab states as somewhat reluctant participants, a bit like players in a high-stakes poker game who weren't quite sure if they wanted to go all in.
So not exactly a united front charging in to save the day.
Not quite. Morris describes how these Arab states were divided among themselves, each with their own agendas, priorities, and internal political dynamics. Some leaders, like King Abdullah of Jordan, were more interested in expanding their own territory than in liberating Palestine for the Palestinians.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was in many ways. Morris highlights the poor performance of the Arab armies, which were often poorly equipped, lacking coordination, and plagued by internal rivalries.
Wow.
He even quotes Arab leaders expressing frustration at their own military's ineffectiveness.
So not exactly a well-oiled machine.
No, not at all. And this lack of cohesion and effectiveness played a significant role in their ultimate defeat.
Now, how does Pappé view the involvement of the Arab states?
Well, he doesn't shy away from criticizing their shortcomings either.
Okay.
He acknowledges the internal divisions, the lack of preparedness, and the strategic blunders that hampered their efforts.
But does he offer a different interpretation of their motivations?
He does. While acknowledging their rhetoric of support for the Palestinians, Pappé argues that the Arab states were ultimately more concerned with their own strategic interests and regional power dynamics.
Okay.
He suggests that some Arab leaders were hesitant to fully commit to the Palestinian cause, fearing the consequences of a decisive Israeli victory.
So he's suggesting that the Arab states were playing a more calculated game, perhaps hedging their bets and prioritizing their own national interests over the fate of the Palestinians.
That's one way to interpret it, and Pappé even criticizes some Arab leaders for making deals with the Israelis behind the backs of the Palestinians, further undermining the Arab war effort.
It's a complicated picture with layers of political maneuvering and strategic calculations.
It is, and it raises questions about the sincerity of the Arab states' commitment to the Palestinian cause, adding another layer of complexity to this already tangled historical narrative.
Right. It's a reminder that even seemingly straightforward events like a war are often driven by a complex interplay of motivations, both idealistic and self-serving.
Absolutely, and it's our job as engaged readers and critical thinkers to try to untangle those threads and understand the forces at play.
Okay, so we've explored the pre-war tensions, the role of militias, and the involvement of neighboring Arab states.
Right.
But one of the most devastating legacies of the 1948 war is the Palestinian refugee crisis.
Yes.
The displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, many of whom ended up in refugee camps in neighboring countries.
It's a tragedy that continues to this day, a wound that has yet to heal.
Right.
And it's a central point of contention in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So how do Morris and Pappé address this incredibly sensitive and emotionally charged issue?
Well, Morris, with his focus on military and political events, acknowledges the scale of the refugee crisis and describes the hardships faced by those who were displaced.
He even uses personal accounts to illustrate the human cost of the war.
Right.
The individual stories of families torn apart,
Yes.
homes lost, and lives shattered.
He does, but he stops short of attributing the exodus solely to forced expulsions.
So he's not denying that the expulsions happened, but he's suggesting that there were other factors involved.
Exactly. He points to the chaos and panic of war.
Okay.
The fear of reprisals and the spread of rumors and misinformation, all contributing to the mass displacement.
So he's presenting a more complex picture,
Yes.
arguing that the exodus was a result of multiple factors, not just a deliberate policy of expulsion.
Precisely. Now, Pappé, as you might expect, sees the refugee crisis as a direct and inevitable consequence of the ethnic cleansing he claims was orchestrated by Zionist leaders.
He argues that the displacement of Palestinians was intentional and systematic, a key part of their plan to secure a Jewish state with a Jewish majority.
Exactly. He points to the evidence of massacres, expulsions, and the destruction of villages as part of a deliberate campaign to terrorize Palestinians and drive them from their homes.
So for Pappé, the refugee crisis isn't just a tragic consequence of war. It's evidence of a calculated crime.
That's his central argument. And he argues that this historical injustice needs to be acknowledged and addressed if there's ever to be a genuine resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
It's a powerful and controversial claim, one that continues to fuel debate and shape perceptions of the conflict.
Absolutely. And it highlights the enduring legacy of 1948, how this pivotal event continues to cast a long shadow over the region.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past, it's about the present and the future, about how we remember, how we interpret, and how we learn from the events that have shaped our world.
And it's a call for empathy,
Yeah.
for understanding, and for a willingness to engage with complex and often painful historical narratives.
Okay, so we've explored the main events of the 1948 war and seen how Morris and Pappé offer such starkly different interpretations of what transpired.
Yeah.
But what about the aftermath, the long-term consequences that continue to shape the region to this day?
That's a crucial question. The 1948 war didn't end neatly with a peace treaty, and a happily ever after it left behind a legacy of displacement, resentment, mistrust, an ongoing conflict that continues to define the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians.
So how do our two authors grapple with this complex and enduring legacy?
Well, Morris, as is his style,
Yeah.
focuses on the military and political aspects of the war's aftermath.
Okay.
He discusses the armistice agreements that were signed between Israel and its Arab neighbors,
Okay.
creating a fragile peace but not a lasting solution.
So it's more of a ceasefire than a genuine resolution.
Exactly. And Morris highlights the ongoing tensions and conflicts that followed the arms race, the border skirmishes, and the lack of a comprehensive peace settlement that addressed the underlying issues of the conflict.
He paints a rather bleak picture.
He does. He even suggests that the 1948 war was just the first chapter in a longer and perhaps even more intractable conflict, one that continues to plague the region to this day.
So for Morris, 1948 wasn't a conclusion, but rather a beginning, the opening salvo in a long and bloody struggle.
That's his interpretation. Now, Pappé, as you might expect, takes a different approach. He focuses on the human cost of the war and the ongoing suffering of the Palestinian people.
He talks about the refugee camps,
Right.
the loss of land and property,
Right.
the denial of the right of return, and the ongoing struggle for recognition and justice.
He does, and he argues that the displacement of Palestinians wasn't just a consequence of war, but rather a deliberate and ongoing policy of dispossession,
Okay.
a process that continues to this day.
So for Pappé, the legacy of 1948 is one of ongoing injustice and dispossession.
Yeah.
A wound that continues to fester.
Exactly. And he links this historical injustice to the current situation in Israel-Palestine, arguing that it needs to be acknowledged and addressed if there's ever to be a genuine and lasting peace.
Wow, it's incredible how these two authors, starting from the same historical events, arrive at such radically different conclusions about the war's legacy.
It's a testament to the power of narrative, to how our interpretations of the past shape our understanding of the present and even our vision for the future.
It's also a challenge to us as readers and as engaged citizens to think critically about the narratives we encounter,
Yes.
to question assumptions, to seek out multiple perspectives,
Absolutely.
and to strive for a deeper understanding of complex and often contentious historical events.
Absolutely, because history isn't just about the past.
Right.
It's about the present and the future, about how we make sense of the world and our place in it.
Right.
And engaging with these different interpretations, challenging our own assumptions, and striving for empathy and understanding are all crucial steps in navigating the complex terrain of history and its enduring legacy.
Okay. I think we've delved pretty deeply into the content of these two books we've explored. The pre-war tensions, the roles of various actors,
Right.
the key events of the war itself, and the war's lasting impact on the region.
We have. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey, and I hope it's encouraged you to think more critically about the narratives we encounter and the complexities of history.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now I think it's time to step back and consider the broader implications of these contrasting narratives.
Okay.
What does it mean for our understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today?
Right.
How does it shape our vision for a possible resolution?
These are crucial questions, and they get to the heart of why this deep dive is so important.
Right.
Stay with us as we explore these broader implications and grapple with the enduring legacy of 1948.
Welcome back to Books and Bytes Debates.
Where we've been, wrestling with those contrasting narratives of the 1948 war in Palestine presented in Benny Morris's 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War, and Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine.
Right. It's been a heavy but illuminating journey, exploring the events leading up to the war, the roles of the various actors, and that just heart-wrenching refugee crisis.
And, we've seen how Morris and Pappé, while drawing on the same historical events, frame them so differently,
Yeah.
leading to vastly different conclusions about the nature of the conflict itself.
Yes. Exactly. Morris, with his emphasis on military strategy and diplomatic maneuvering, sees a war with multiple causes, a tragic clash of national aspirations.
Right. While Pappé, focusing on the systematic expulsion of Palestinians, argues for a deliberate act of ethnic cleansing, a planned dispossession.
And it's this fundamental difference in interpretation that makes this whole discussion so challenging, so thought-provoking.
It does. It forces us to confront the very nature of historical truth. How do we make sense of the past when the narratives are so divergent?
Right.
Is it about finding some objective middle ground, or is it about recognizing the validity of multiple perspectives, even if they seem irreconcilable?
It's a tough question. And honestly, I'm not sure there's an easy answer, but what's really struck me is how deeply these narratives are intertwined with identity and memory, both for Israelis and Palestinians.
Absolutely, for both sides. 1948 is a defining moment, a year that continues to shape their understanding of themselves and their place in the world.
Right. For many Israelis, it's seen as a miraculous victory, a David and Goliath story of the birth of their nation against all odds.
While for Palestinians, it's remembered as the Nakba, the catastrophe, a time of immense lost dispossession and forced exile.
And these contrasting memories are passed down through generations, shaping their views on the conflict, on justice, on the very possibility of peace.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It lives on in the hearts and minds of people today, shaping their identities, their perceptions, their political realities.
And it influences the narratives we tell, the language we use, the very way we frame this ongoing conflict.
Which brings us back to the responsibility we all have when engaging with this history.
Absolutely. We can't just passively accept any narrative that comes our way.
No, we have to be active readers, critical thinkers, questioning assumptions, seeking out multiple perspectives,
You're right.
and recognizing the biases inherent in any historical account.
We also have to be mindful of the language we use, understanding that words have power. They can wound, they can perpetuate injustice, they can fuel the very conflict we're trying to understand.
Yeah, it's about recognizing the humanity of all those involved, regardless of which narrative we find ourselves drawn to.
Right.
And remembering that behind the political arguments and historical debates, there are real people whose lives have been profoundly affected by this conflict.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to this question. What are we supposed to do with these contrasting narratives? It feels almost wrong to choose sides or declare one narrative the winner.
I agree. It would be reductive, almost disrespectful to the complexity of what happened, the human suffering involved.
Exactly. Instead, I think it's about holding these multiple perspectives in tension, recognizing their validity, their limitations, the emotions they evoke, and the impact they continue to have.
Yeah, it's about understanding how these narratives came to be, the historical forces, the power dynamics, the individual and collective experiences that shaped them.
And it's about recognizing how these narratives continue to shape the present, influencing policies, fueling conflict, hindering reconciliation. So where do we go from here? How do we make sense of this complex and often contradictory history? What can we learn from these clashing narratives?
Well, I think it starts with humility, a recognition that we can never fully grasp the totality of any historical event.
Right.
There will always be gaps in our knowledge, blind spots in our perspective, and limitations to our understanding.
Exactly.
It also requires a commitment to ongoing learning, to seeking out new information, to engaging with diverse perspectives, and to being open to having our minds changed.
And perhaps most importantly, it calls for empathy,
Yes.
for trying to understand the experiences of others, even those we might disagree with.
Because ultimately, peace and reconciliation can only emerge from a foundation of empathy, understanding, and a shared commitment to a just and equitable future.
Well said. As we conclude this deep dive, I'm left with this thought. Both Morris and Pappé, despite their vastly different approaches, dedicate a significant portion of their books to the issue of evidence.
That's right. They meticulously cite their sources, analyze documents, and present arguments based on what they believe to be the historical record.
Right, and it made me wonder, is there a possibility for some kind of collaborative historical project, a joint effort by Israeli and Palestinian historians to re-examine the events of 1948?
That's a fascinating and provocative idea, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission of sorts, where historians from both sides could come together, share their sources and interpretations, and try to create a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of this pivotal moment.
I know it's a long shot given the current political climate, but it's a vision worth striving for, a potential path towards healing and reconciliation.
Indeed, a shared history, even if it's a history of disagreement, could be a powerful step towards a shared future.
Well, on that hopeful note, I think we'll bring this deep dive to a close. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the complexities of history. We encourage you to continue exploring these issues, to read, to research, to engage in respectful dialogue, and to never stop questioning until next time. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep seeking out those multiple perspectives. That's it for this episode of Books and Bytes Debates. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into history's most intriguing disagreements.